Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lunchtime conversation. My name's Diane Coyle, and I'm Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. And it's a real pleasure to be in conversation today with my Cambridge colleague, Partha Dasgupta, who's the Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics. And we're going to talk about a range of issues, starting with a review that Partha published, commissioned by the Treasury, on biodiversity, which of course is incredibly prominent, Partha, but I don't know if everybody will have had a chance to read the review, which is a very rich piece of work indeed. So I wondered if you could start us off in this conversation by saying something about what are the key messages that you would want people to take away from the biodiversity review, and also perhaps what you learned yourself from doing it. It built on a huge body of work that you've done in the past, but what did you yourself take from it?
Well, my immediate motivation really was, and I can say this at my age, I guess, I've been quite, over the years, developed a real serious worry about the direction in which growth and development economics and the economics of poverty have moved. Essentially, they have moved without the recognition that the human economy is embedded in nature in a serious way. And of course, that's a sort of colorful way of saying it. Translating that into formal economic modeling takes work. And in some sense, what the review is trying to do, the first thing it's doing is to provide a grammar from the most aggregate point of view to the community level, household level point of view of economic life. Okay. And that doesn't look very similar to the way you would get an account of, say, development and growth economics, or our understanding of economic possibilities in the future, nor of the economics of poverty. So that's the first thing, that it's really an overarching point of view which is being articulated there. Then, of course, there are some policy issues, goes without saying, and one of the things it does is to point out that embeddedness of the human economy in nature means that we really have to account for our activities, the account for being consequences to the biosphere of our human activities. And that takes me into one particular set of directions which are related to your own interests and your own work, which is measurement of economic success or economic failure. And accounting for nature is something which is very prominent in my review at the macroeconomic policy level. And then, of course, at the level of households, if particularly in poor countries, they do account for nature. They husband their resources, it goes without saying, otherwise they'd be out. So in some sense, the review tries to reconcile the fact that the small scale human economies in poorest countries recognize nature's pertinence, nature's absolute essentiality, in a way that formal models of economics don't. So one of the messages is, of course, accounting for nature, and that leads the review to develop the idea of inclusive wealth. That is, we should be measuring the wealth of economies rather than the GDP of economies. That's one very important area of discourse in the review. And there are others, but we can come to that if you like.
I want to pick up on that point about inclusive wealth, because you and I share this perspective that measurement of inclusive wealth is particularly important. And what I liked about the review is the way that that's embedded within a whole consistent intellectual framework. And although we are at a point where it just seems extraordinary today that economics hasn't accounted for nature or incorporated nature to the extent that we need to, we are seeing some progress. We saw the adoption of the system of environmental economic accounts, ecosystem accounts, by the UN last year. We've seen a lot of progress on measurement of natural capital in a number of countries. And the World Bank has published an updated Inclusive Wealth of Nations review. And so I think my next question is a dual one, and partly to myself as well. It's about how much we think the understanding of the importance of nature to economics has actually changed? Or is it still a bit of a bywater? You know, famously, the top 5 general journals haven't published much on environmental economics. It's left to field journals and so on. But then the follow-on is about, perhaps we ought to explain a bit more the way that the framework, the inclusive wealth framework, is actually the sort of unified conceptual framework for thinking about the economy and economic development. And so maybe you could pick up on that point, because it draws very much on some earlier work that you did. And then we can discuss a bit whether this really has changed, you know, whether we are at a bit of a turning point in economics more generally.
Right. Yes, of course. Well, first thing is that when we measure something and we use that measure for policy purposes and see that that should be the basis on which policy should be determined or identified, we must take care that the measure stems from welfare considerations, ethical considerations, because that's what's going to drive it. We want to ask, are we doing the right thing? Are we on the wrong track? Or are we moving sustainably? Or and so forth, okay? Now, one of the things that really puzzles me is the inconsistency within mainstream economics, the one we teach and that we follow, is the fact that when you do social cost benefit analysis, you look for the impact of a project that is being proposed on welfare, because you're looking at the present discounted value of net social benefits, okay? Now, the present discounted value is the sum of the flow of net benefits, discounted maybe, but you're adding. Now, the sum of flows is, of course, the stock. So now, if your criterion is present discounted value, or let's say even the rate of return, which is another form of it, is a social rate of returns, it's another form of it. If your criterion there is on stock, then why do you think GDP is going to pick that up? In fact, you're not using GDP in cost benefit analysis. And yet our entire macroeconomic, the conceptual background of measuring success, if you like, is one where it's not GDP at all. Sorry, it's not wealth at all. It's not the stock. It's in fact the flow, and it doesn't take into account the depreciation of capital. And then of course the main kind of capital that is missing is nature in it. So that's really a missing bit. And what I've tried to do in the work that you're mentioning is that it arrives at inclusive wealth. But by that I mean a wealth as sum of the accounting value of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital, okay? The sum of it, the addition of that. We arrive at it by showing that, in fact, if you have a criterion of intergenerational welfare, say the Ramsey integral, discounted value of the flow of utilities, if you like, which is a key ethical framework that we use, that is used in macroeconomics when we teach it, certainly. You'd give me a measure, an idea of intergenerational well-being, and then then I can construct a measure of wealth, inclusive wealth, in the way I mentioned just now, such that these two objects move in the same direction, same way. If one goes up over a period of time, the other goes up over a period of time. If one goes down over a period of time through the accumulation process that you're following, the other goes down as well. So there's a perfect coincidence of their movements. The two, of course, are different objects, but they are tied together through the accounting prices. That's where the ethics comes in when you measure inclusive wealth. Now, of course, in some cases, the accounting prices may be market prices. They'll be the first approximation. But in natural capital, so much of these assets are unpriced. They don't have a price. And in some cases, they have a negative price because we subsidize in a massive way the use of natural capital. To the tune of about 3 to 4% of global GDP is actually a subsidy to nature. So given that, we really have to work hard at trying to estimate accounting prices. And as you rightly mentioned, much work has been done in that. So that's the basis. So it's not an ad hoc. It's not as though I've suddenly said, look, we have to measure wealth. Because why? Because let's say Adam Smith wrote on the wealth of nations. Therefore, we must go back to wealth. That's not the reason. The reason is there's a deep connection between wealth and well-being, but well-being across the generations, not just today, but tomorrow, day after, and so forth, which is, of course, exactly how we should be thinking about economic possibilities. Okay, so now question, is this, how is that penetrating our understanding, the economist understanding of economic possibilities? I think here, you're dead right in pointing to the fact that international institutions and some government departments, like the ONS, for example, are ahead of economics departments. We don't teach this stuff, as far as I know. I haven't seen it in any coursework in let's say in Cambridge, or no, I don't know about other places. I haven't looked at them, but I don't get the sense that this reorientation of economics that really is needed. And by the way, I should say immediately that I'm methodologically very conservative, largely because economics is an extraordinarily powerful subject. We have inherited a language which has been created by some of the greatest minds of the past 100 years. So I'm not about to disabuse that. So this is not a complaint about, that we don't have the right, we don't have the tools. We do. We're just misusing them. We are misusing economics. So I don't see that the graduate student really comes to terms with it, the microeconomic problems that they study. They're not all of, the idea isn't that everybody works on this field. That goes without saying. And many questions have no bearing on the nature of the asset that you're looking at. Okay, many micro questions that you might ask worth investigating. But none of the questions seems to be prompted by this enormous crisis we now currently face, which we have created. Namely, we have trashed the biosphere beyond belief over the last 70 years or so. And while the growth models of the early 1950s, mid-1950s, there was some justification of neglecting nature because the global economy was small beer relative to the size of the biosphere. Today, it's not. GDP is now about 15 to 17 times higher now than it was in 1950. And then the earth sciences and the ecological sciences are also coming to the point of view, given their evidence, that something dramatic happened in the post-war period, that we sort of expanded our scope and our imprint on the biosphere. So neglecting it today is inexcusable, whereas it was a reasonable approximation, I think, in the early, mid-50s, when countries were coming out of the war and devastated economies, that they concentrate on the accumulation of this produced and human capital. But now we need to worry hugely about finding ways to concentrate on the fact that we have been depreciating nature at a massive rate, and it's not being recorded.
I might come back to some of the political economy issues, the policy issues that raises, Partha. But I think the point you're making about the welfare framework is really interesting. And I came to being interested in economic measurement through the question, if as a person interested in public policy, I want economics to contribute to making things better, then what does making things better mean, and how do we know? And so we have to answer those questions. And when I started looking at GDP, the penny dropped after many years of manipulating data that actually real GDP is a welfare measure. It's just not a very good one. And so we've been using a metric that targets, ultimately things that we don't want to achieve, that we want not to happen. When I say this to people, they're a bit puzzled about, GDP just measures transactions in the economy. How can you say it's a welfare measure? And the answer is because, not just the point you're making about not taking account of the future in a flow measure, but also when you deflate, you're using a constant utility construct to think about what inflation means. Yep. And then when you start to do any hedonic adjustment, you're bringing in even more issues relating to preferences and utility, but without really acknowledging that it's a welfare measure. I'm now pretty old too, so when I was taught economics as an undergraduate, it did include some welfare economics. But I think as a profession, we need to come back to that, because we are at exactly the point you're talking about of facing some really, really big challenges. So my sense is that there is a real mood change, that we are going to develop metrics that speak more directly to a sense of what improving welfare means. My concern about it is that there's a sort of proliferation of different ways of doing it. And ONS is thinking about missing capitals and the wealth framework, and that will probably get picked up in the system of national accounts revision that's going on now. But there are lots of others too. And I think it would be great if as economists, using, as you say, the crunchiest neoclassical economic methods, we can provide and explain and communicate this consistent framework and the sort of welfare basis on which it sits. And if you do that explicitly, well, then you can have a conversation with people about, is that how we want to think about welfare or not? Yeah. I think it's tremendously important, and the review and also the grammar it's given us is tremendously important. But I wanted to pick up on the policy aspects, some of which you talk about in the review. And payment for ecosystem services, for example, you advocate as one kind of tool. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yes, of course. The payment for ecosystem service is a bit like trying to simulate something like a market exchange, goes without saying. And let's say, and one level, of course, payment for ecosystem service is exactly what we need. The form of it, and it may depend on the context. Currently, it's gaining traction in a number of countries, Costa Rica, China, in this country as well, whether the payment is made by the beneficiary of an ecosystem service that the neighboring piece of property confers to the owner of that other property, or whether it's the state giving money for the protection of nature and so forth. Those are details, and goes without saying they are very important. But conceptually, we are looking at putting a price on the effect on nature, the price to that bears the cost in terms of the loss of productivity of the asset which you're diminishing. Okay, so that's okay, that's fine. I think what I've been writing on, where I think there is a big neglect, is at the international level. The open seas, for example, are the global public good, and yet they're open access. So we have a standard problem of the tragedy of the commons, which all first-year students now learn in undergraduates, even through the prisoner's dilemma game, as an and yet we're not doing anything about it. Meanwhile, of course, the oceans are being pressed in no uncertain terms. For obvious reasons, it's an open access resource. And then on top of that, you have another set of global public goods are the tropical rainforests. They happen to be, but they are not open access. They are within national jurisdiction. And at the local level, they might look like open access, but that's because of the terror of the state, maybe, which will evict inhabitants in the Amazon, for example, or the rainforests who have lived there and they don't have titles to the land in any case, and they get thrown out, maybe even killed, and the land is taken and the forest patch is converted into a plantation or a grazing field for cattle and so forth. Now we read about all that. Now there is a sense in which, of course, because it's national jurisdiction, the incentive that the government has to protect it is far less than what the global community would be willing to pay for, because it's a global public good. So you have two sets of global public goods here, and the question is, what should we do about it? Now we moan about the fact that the rainforests are being are being devastated. We all moan, we read about it, and we say how horrible. But the right thing to do is to have an international understanding whereby the world, the rest of the world compensates the countries which house these rainforests. to protect them. And that can be monitored very easily. So it's not a question of, you're paying and then they're not doing what they said they would do. That can be in some sense fixed because you have so many ways of monitoring whether the agreement is being complied with. Where does that money come from? That'll be billions of dollars actually annually, I would imagine. That will require negotiation, of course, goes without saying, but that's part of the game. That would come from charging for the use of the open seas. Trillions of dollars of merchandise are being shipped across the Pacific and the Atlantic. There's huge fisheries which are destroying the seabeds, as we know. All that can be tempered. We could reduce the pressure by charging for it. Now, when I say we, I mean the global community, obviously. And the only way I can see that happening would be through creation of an international institution which does that, which has the remit to aim at both these problems. And that could raise billions, literally billions. And crude calculations on my part suggest that would more than pay for the kind of benefits, the payment that you need to make to protect the rainforest. Now, anytime you mention international institution, new international institution, you're told, well, no, it's not, you can't do it. It's just too difficult. But at the end of the Second World War, many international institutions were created. The United Nations was created. The World Bank was created, and the IMF was established. Now, these were established. Why? Because they're producing global public goods which needed to be supported. In the case of the World Bank, it was reconstruction and development. In the case of the IMF, it was financial stability, international financial stability. And the United Nations, well, there's hardly anything new in that. So if they could do it, why can't we do it? And we do need it desperately at the moment, because otherwise, basically, you'll have ad hoc policies. Agreement on a protected zone here, a protected zone there, but that's not going to be working.
So this is very persuasive, but I think the difficulty is you're talking about raising taxes, a fiscal authority. And that seems to me to be politically difficult. We've seen in the case of climate change, the difficulties of getting collective agreement about who bears the burden, who bears the cost burden. And so an international institution that has the power to raise taxes on ocean shipping or on plastics and pay individual national governments, the revenues from that seems to me to be a pretty difficult political ask. And I'm not sure, if you think about the European Union and the amount that, the small amount it manages to raise from taxes and transfer among member states, then I'm not sure I see the practical politics of that.
You're absolutely right about that. And I want to be absolutely clear that I did want to put it in the most pristine form, an international institution. If somebody has a better idea of how to do it, that's great. But if somebody says this can't be done, then I think we should forget about it. We can't on Sundays say these are global problems of the most profound order, and then on Mondays to Saturdays say, well, nothing can be done about it. We ought to come clean. It's not for me to say what the institution should be like or could be like, because I'm not an expert on that. But that we need a method by which we charge, where we pay ourselves, if you like. Remember, these are distortion-removing taxes. These are not creating distortions. So in principle, people could be compensated for the losses they suffer on account of the taxes. In principle, that can be done, right? In practice, it's going to be hell's different, no question about that. But we're used to this kind of problem in public finance. All I was suggesting is that payment for ecosystem services is a succinct way of saying that we should bear the burden for using the biosphere's goods and services, because at the moment there is an enormous overshoot. And climate change is, of course, only one manifestation of it. There are many others. You mentioned plastics, you mentioned the erosion of biodiversity, through land use change and so forth. There's just a huge number of problems which together are integrated and are related to each other. And the review actually talks about the whole lot in a unified way. I can't, obviously, it looks pie in the sky to think of international institutions, but maybe people thought that in 1946. I don't know. I wasn't around at that time, old enough to know what was going on. But I dare say somebody says the United Nations, the League of Nations failed. What's going on here? What pie in the sky is this? I don't know, but they seem to have been bold in doing that.
I suppose what we had in the immediate post-war era was both the experience of a massive global crisis and also the intellectual framework in the system of national accounts. So the bit that we're on is the accounting framework, and I suppose the theory of change behind that is that if you can make the costs that we're bearing, the externalities much more apparent, then that will at least indirectly incentivize a different kind of policy choice. So
I think so. I want to come back to a point that you made about GDP and welfare. You're absolutely right. People forget that there was a ethical basis for GDP, even though, of course, we're agreed on its limitations. And I think one way of thinking about it is that it came from the world of study of stationary states. Classical economists have taught in terms of the stationary state. Now, in a stationary state, then of course their net depreciation is zero. That is, net income is, it takes into account the depreciation. So income there, net income, is because you're in a stationary state, you don't have to worry about the fact that the balance of your assets are changing. They're not. The balance remains the same because the relative prices remain the same. I think we forget that, and that it may be you're the expert on that. It may be that helps in the promotion of GDP, but then using it for making it into a welfare measure for a growing economy. That was bad news, given that you're accumulating two types of capital asset, accumulating another, the third one. Okay, but that means that the relative prices are changing. And if that happens, that all those welfare theorems about real national income go overboard. And the moment you recognize that, you then say, well, maybe this wealth accounting stuff, theorem that you and I have just now been discussing, is the dynamic counterpart of the real national income story that the 1930s, people like Hicks, and then Samuelson also wrote about subsequently in the late 40s. But you know that literature much better than I do. So there is a parallel here between the stationary state and the growing economy, and the imbalances that the growing economy causes or has caused by our ignoring of depreciation of natural capital, and then borrowing a measure which came out of a static story into a dynamic one that can cause real havoc, which is what we are discussing. Yeah.
Of course, you mentioned Hicks and Samuelson, both incredibly concerned and interested in fundamental economic welfare.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Concepts and measures.
Exactly.
So it seems to me the agenda that opens up now is actually a lot of it about practicalities. And that's both collecting data on biodiversity, for example, a lot of very granular questions about the right geographic scope over which to collect data about ecosystems, simply collecting more raw data in the way that we do for, if you like, conventional economic transactions. And then the other issue is about actually how do you estimate some of the shadow prices or accounting prices? And I don't know if that's something that you have thought about. And
yeah, sure. I'd like to speak to that.
As a profession, we might start going about that.
No, you're absolutely right for pointing to this. The review goes into it in some detail. First of all, although the review is on the economics of biodiversity, I didn't really write about biodiversity. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. What I did was to make the economics of biodiversity translate into an asset management problem. That we are all asset managers, whether you're a poor, impoverished farmer in South Asia, whether you're a fisherman, impoverished fisherman in coastal Africa, you're managing assets, or whether you're a financier, we're all managing assets, okay? And so the objects of interest are assets. And natural capital, the expression that I've been using in our discussion here, is let's call them bundles of ecosystems. And these ecosystems can be tiny. A garden pond is an ecosystem. It could be a biome, like the oceans. Okay, so that's okay, because we manufactured capital also. You can have a gigantic factory, but then you can also have a stool on which you sit. So that's all right. The size can be different. Doesn't make any difference. So you're looking at assets. Now you do that, then things become clearer, because what you're trying to estimate is the productivity of these assets. What are they doing for the economy? And that's where ecologists are of the profoundest importance, because they have a wealth of understanding of the productivity, these services that such assets as mangroves, so mangrove forest, coral reefs, wetlands, you name it, watersheds and so forth. What are they doing for us? Now, there is a rich literature there, and environmental and resource economists have been working with them for quite some time. It's just that those words don't feature in the journals that our graduate students are encouraged to read and then are encouraged to think of publishing, okay? Because these are published in all sorts of journals, and damn good journals, of course, but they're not seen as relevant or important. So when you say, how do you estimate shadow prices? Well, of course, there are going to be problems, goes without saying, but there's tons of work in doing that. For example, just let me give you one example. I'll give you two examples. One example would be, say, you're creating a shrimp farm in, say, Sri Lanka or wherever. In fact, as it happens, I was there when that pond was being constructed. Now, in the process of constructing that, of course, you're destroying quite a bit of the coastal ecology, at least the local coastal ecology, all right? Because you're creating an artificial system of brackish water. And in the process of doing that, you're probably destroying some of the mangrove forests that are the nursery for fisheries. Now, if you do that, and so you measure the benefits of having a shrimp farm, then of course that's standard stuff. What's the revenue likely to be had from exporting shrimps to UK or whatever? Then what about the damage you're causing? Now you say, well, all right, what's the damage caused by mangroves being depleted in the neighborhood? Well, then you ask what the benefits are from a mangrove. I mean, the anthropocentric benefits. I'm just now looking at the anthropocentric benefits, okay? Well, there's a lot of work on that. Protection of neighboring villages from storms is one, and they can be quantified, and they have been quantified, by the way, from looking at neighboring villages and with differential destruction of mangroves and the additional costs that are borne periodically because of the depletion of mangroves. Then, of course, the nursery as nursery for fisheries. Okay, so there are ways of doing that, and there are papers that have been published, and they'll have to be done on a case-by-case basis. Goes without saying, just as you do for any kind of project. Never mind environmental problems. Another example is a very famous one, which is about the benefits of watersheds, and they clean water. Natural cleansing process. And in the case of the Catskill watershed, it was New York City which was deriving the benefits of the clean water coming because of the Catskill. But the watershed had been deteriorating through land use change, housing projects, and so forth, to the extent that you had to worry about whether New York City could drink the water. And the natural thing would be to look at the alternative, which would be to create a filtering plant. And you look at that cost. And you could then ask, what's the cost of restoring the watershed? And this kind of study has been done. Of course, as you know, the decision was to actually restore the watershed rather than build a filtering plant. So depending on the context, there are ways of getting into the idea that what we are interested in for wealth accounting, and therefore, in this case, policy analysis, is the social worth of ecosystems. And that means the productivity the goods and services the ecosystem offers the human economy. I'm only looking at the anthropocentric viewpoint now. Of course, you could add to that the intrinsic value of nature and so forth. You can do that. Of course, that's for sure. In principle, you can do that. The advantage of looking at the problem this way is to recognize that, look, we're really borrowing from our understanding of the value of physical capital, produced capital. And there, for the whole of economics is built on that, all right? Tables, chairs, roads, buildings, factories, and so forth. Try and value the benefits from that. And every investor does that. And we want to borrow that language to a class of assets which have imperfect institutions, maybe complete lack of markets. You know, there could be open access or whatever. So I think once you do that, then it becomes a lot more easy. And a lot of work is being done on that, actually. And you mentioned the World Bank. Actually, United Nations Environment Program preceded the World Bank by many years. They produced the Inclusive Wealth Report of 2012, 2014, 2018, and there's one coming up in 2022 of the comparative analysis of 120 countries over a period of time to see how the emerging wealth of nations, the inclusive wealth of nations, and they do a darn good job, by the way. They include climate change because they use accounting price of carbon to include the depreciation of the atmosphere as a sink for carbon.
They're all excellent reports for people who don't already know them. It seems to me that part of the challenge, Partha, is actually just integrating this body of knowledge. And as you say, there's a lot of work being done by environmental economists and ecologists that could be used with the sort of default ways of thinking about things. For example, thinking about the substitutability between green assets and grey assets when you're thinking about planning infrastructure.
Yes.
And not automatically defaulting to concrete flood defences when you should look at a much broader range of potential investments. And we don't have that integration.
That's absolutely right. I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, the way we think of ignoring natural assets means, of course, that if you destroy a piece of natural capital and create the physical capital, produced capital on it, it's the benefits of the produced capital which is recorded, but what is lost through the deterioration of the ecosystem on which the produced capital has been built is unrecorded. So we're back to the measurement issue of not taking into account the depreciation. That's absolutely right, quite. But one other thing, which is, I think, one of the worries I had, and this is explored at some length in the review, is that investment in nature has a different carries with it a different mental picture from investment in, let's say, a infrastructure, road infrastructure. That's because in the latter case, you're thinking of a very active behavior, you know, drills, bulldozers, men in hard hats, and so forth, okay? It's a sort of a very aggressive thing. I don't mean it in a bad way. I'm simply saying that, you know, it requires brawn as well as the machines. Whereas investing in nature would typically mean letting it be. It's waiting. You let the wetland be, not tamper with it, maybe a little bit of help here and there, but broadly speaking, you want it to recover on its own. So it's the cost of waiting. And so you might say, well, where's the beef? Since the benefit is going to be in the future when it recovers and discounted at a reasonable rate. And of course that vanishes and you say, why should I wish to do that? The problem is, you see, that's again bad economics, because if natural capital is declining and the rest are other forms of capital are expanding, which is the case now and has been for the last 70 years or so in a massive way, then the relative price of natural capital to that rest will be rising. Because for the reason you just now mentioned, because the balance of the two are changing. And if the relative price of natural capital keeps on increasing and your projection is that it's increasing, then of course that relative price increase will be included in your estimate of net benefits in the future. of the process of the act of waiting. And if that capital gains, if you like, the capital gains term relative to produced capital, if that is high enough, your discount rate may be negative, by the way, and would be negative if it's high enough. And so what you're going to benefit in the future is actually amplified to today rather than being diminished. So you have all, how do I put it? Doing economics correctly requires you to tinker with many of the bad habits you've got into. Because typically when you do investment project analysis, and I know quite a bit about it because I wrote a book with Partha and Steve Bartlin many years ago on cost-benefit analysis. For obvious reasons, for ease, it is all typically assumed that the net benefit flow is constant over the lifetime of the project. You don't have any other data. So you say, well, here's an investment requirement over 4 years to create this, let's say, a dam, and then it produces a net benefit for the next 50 years or so. But these net benefit flows are assumed to be constant. Now, I know when you don't know anything, you might say, all right, I can't, it could go either way, so you need to make it constant. But here you do know. You know that the relative prices are going to change, and they're changing because of the macroeconomic policies. One is going down and the others are going up, the asset levels, and therefore the relative prices will be changing. And then pretending that they won't change, that's bad economics. So you have to be alert to many of these finer details, which is what your question was pointing to, and your own work suggests sensitivity to these very detailed questions, which will have huge influence on decision making and our general language we use for discussing economic policy. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think there's a really interesting analogy with how we think about heritage assets, which again is something that we're actively deciding to leave in a certain state with some of the natural capital assets. And I think that analogy might be worth pursuing, because people do find it much harder to think about the passive rather than the active investments.
That's right.
We're coming close to 1:15, and we will then be letting people get on to the next sessions in the conference. Just a final quick thought, if you will, about what all this implies for the role of government, because we're talking about missing markets and externalities. And we've come out of a period of 4 decades where the presumption has been that government should leave well alone unless there's a really well-specified market failure to intervene in. In 2 minutes, do you want to reflect a bit on whether...
I think the answer depends hugely on where we are, what level of intervention we are looking at. In many countries, I would say the government ought to let communities alone, because what they've done is to interfere like crazy and been to the detriment of the world's poorest. And I'm talking about in Africa's parts of East Asia, Latin America, and so forth. The best thing they can do is to let people alone. And that doesn't mean laissez-faire. I'm talking about letting communities alone to allow their norms to work on the assets that are very relevant, rather than impose ways of doing things which will ruin culture, ruins communities. There's lots of examples of that. And of course, here again, it's judicious issues. In some things, the state is essential, goes without saying. Investment in clean energy requires an active government pursuit of incentives, identifying incentives which allow that to happen, and they have to make investment themselves. And in many other things, they ought to let people alone. And in fact, in this country, you are fortunate that the civil society is pretty powerful. So you have to consult local government, and that's a good thing, goes without saying. But it really varies from place to place. And since I'm much involved in research and trying to understand the economics of poverty, the role of the state and the community is the role of the community in particular is something that I really take very seriously. And I've written extensively on it, and my review has it too. So there, I think in many cases, the state ought to just let communities alone and give a helping hand, of course, go without saying, because a lot government can do that community on its own can't do, particularly an isolated community. But broadly speaking, not interfering in their decision-making process is probably a very wise thing.
We've not really had time to explore the full breadth of your work, Partha. It's always a real pleasure to talk to you. So I think I'll conclude by saying that if anybody is listening hasn't had chance yet to read the Biodiversity Review, you please do so. It's a wonderful piece of work, and that grammar, I think, is really important and something that anybody should read, whatever area of economics your own interest is. But we have got to 1:15, and I've got strict instructions that we stop on time. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference. So thank you from me. Thank you to Partha. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you very much. And it's been, as usual, a pleasure to talk to you, Diane.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.